satisfy a historian. No tangible records exist dating to the time of origin, that is, no verifiable artifacts from the 5th century BCE. The earliest physical evidence of Buddhism was produced 200 years later in the 3rd century. These are the commands or edicts of King Ashoka, inscribed on rocks and pillars, some of which you can see in this image. King Ashoka is famous for becoming a Buddhist convert in order to atone for his brutal conquests. Without his patronage, it's unlikely that Buddhism would have expanded into a world religion. So the fact that we're gathered here today, I think we can attribute that in part to King Ashoka. His edicts promote ethical principles, and they mention the Buddhist Sangha, the evidence, but they do not include any statements attributed to the Buddha. Well, what about the teachings? How far back do those records go? The earliest sutra scrolls that have been preserved were written on birch bark. They were discovered in what's now Pakistan. This record of the teachings dates to the 1st century CE, the Common Era, which is, of course, 500 years after the Buddha's lifetime. Historic documents like these are just small fragments of the entire Buddhist scriptures that we can access today. Apparently, this gigantic collection of texts was transmitted orally for hundreds of years before ever being written down. They were then recopied and translated many times over the centuries, and these particular birch bark fragments are actually the earliest that have survived. Because almost none of those intermediate copies has survived, it's not known what changes might have been introduced along the way. Nevertheless, the sutras, particularly the ones we call the Pali scriptures, well, they contain a wealth of detail that makes them sound much more like history than like a fable. The teachings have a degree of self-consistency, suggesting that they flowed originally from a single intelligence, namely the mind of Siddhartha Gautama. Everything that can be asserted concerning the historical Buddha derives from these scriptures. How did the Buddha choose to describe himself? This passage is a favorite of mine. Are you a god? No. Are you an angel? No. Are you a spirit? No. Are you a human being? No. Then what are you? Remember me as one who has woken up. Which is to say, he is enlightenment itself and has no other personal identity. Here is another passage that I find quite striking. He's referring to himself. The Buddha, or the Tathagata, has abandoned that form by which one describing the Tathagata might describe him. Liberated from reckoning in terms of form, the Tathagata is deep, immeasurable, hard to fathom, like the ocean. How would one go about creating images of such a person? A person who cannot be reduced to human form. Well, that would present a challenge for the artist. In India, the earliest representations of the Buddha do not depict him in human form. And I'd like to share some examples with you. So what we have here is a relief sculpture, and it depicts the attack of the army of Mara. If you recall, when Siddhartha was meditating under the Bodhi tree, the army of Mara, these spirits, attacked him and tried to prevent him from realizing awakening. So, of course, we have the tree is here, the trunk, and then on either side we have various figures engaged in extreme gesturing. And then in the center, well, it's an empty chair. This is the way the Buddha was represented early on in Indian artworks, by the empty chair under the Bodhi tree. He's not to be depicted in human form. Here's another example. In this case, it's within an architectural setting, and the empty chair or seat is here. So this is the back of the chair, the legs, and then the seat itself is looked at edged on, so that's all you can glimpse of it. Behind, well, this must be the trunk of the Bodhi tree, and some leaves are hanging down. On either side, we have devotees who are paying reverence to the Buddha. They're kneeling and in gasho, just like we do. And then some figures on either side, and then these interesting sort of symbols. You're going to see some more of those shortly. Just try to get a visual memory of that. We'll come back to it. And then over here, of course, we have the elephant, a frequently used symbol of the Buddha. I hope you can see this at least a little bit. It's another empty chair, the Bodhi tree here, the trunk, and then the chair down here, and then a pair of followers kneeling on either side, and then various others are gathered to, as I take it, bring offerings, perhaps of flowers or garments. This one is similar. Empty chair. This time you can see the woven back of the chair. The seat is rendered in sort of a crude perspective view here. The tree in the background. And then I want to call your attention to this detail. Can anybody identify what's down there at the bottom?
Feet.
Someone said feet. They look like they might be zoris. They're not zoris, but or thongs. They're meant to be the footprint of the Buddha. So let's see how that gets amplified. So another common way of representing him is with his footprints, right? Not the physical form, just the footprints. And the soles of his feet were understood to have emblems on them, such that when he walked in the dirt, these prints would be left behind. What we have here, these are, as you can probably see, these are the toes up at the top, right foot, left foot, toes at the top, heel down here, and on the toes, some of you can see the manji, what we also call a swastika, right? So in ancient India, this was a commonly used symbol for a religious symbol, not restricted just to Buddhism. In the middle here, under the arch of the foot, it appears to be a Dharma wheel. And then this symbol, which I pointed out before on the other image, it's a trident sitting on top of what I believe is an open lotus flower. This is called a Tri Ratna. It's a symbol of the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Another pair of footprints with the same type of emblems. The manji, this could be a lotus blossom or maybe the Dharma wheel, and then the Tri Ratna down here. This is in the time before the Buddha would be depicted in human form. Like of course, you've all seen countless statues of the Buddha or images like the one we have here on the Naijin, but this is in a time before that was done. Here's another pair of footprints, and all of those same emblems that I was just highlighting are present here too. If you look very closely, you can see them. The manji right there, the wheel, and then the Tri Ratna is down here. Another way of representing him is with just the wheel. So in this image, people have gathered to pay homage to the Buddha, represented as the wheel of the Dharma. He used that expression in his own sermons. The Dharma wheel has been set in motion. Here are more wheels standing in for the physical form of the Buddha. These are on top of columns, okay? And then this one here on the right the three lions surmounting this column, the lions like that are the symbol of King Ashoka. So in this case, the wheel partly means the Buddha, and it partly means the king himself, the wheel-turning monarch. This is not from India. It's not the Buddha. This was produced in Italy, so it represents a Roman orator, 1st century BCE. Why am I showing you this? Because the influence of Greek and Roman artistic styles reached over into India. And incredibly, among the very first images of the Buddha in human form looked like this. Very much under the influence of Mediterranean civilization. So we have this idealized, yet somehow naturalistically portrayed human form with the heavy draperies, all right? The gesture, this gesture is not just saying hi. It's called the fear not mudra, the fear not gesture, and both of these statues would have been doing that. This one, of course, sorry. I beg your pardon. In this case, the arm is not there. So the face is beautifully rendered. It's there's both a kind of a calmness and a dignity to these images. The one on the left, there's just a slight hint of a smile. The gaze appears to be directed off into the distance, as I perceive it. The one on the right, it's a neutral expression. The gaze is downward, suggesting that he's engaged in self-examination. Both of these represent the Buddha as like an ideal sage, a wise person who is perhaps not too much concerned with everyday affairs. So this was in a part of what's now part of Pakistan, under the influence of Greek culture. In central India, at about the same time, you began to see images of the Buddha that look quite different. This fellow is, he's seated, of course, and, oh, I forgot to mention on the previous slide, but on this one too, around the head of the Buddha, here and in the previous ones, this is a halo. Here is where the halo makes its first appearance in art history, in images of the Buddha. So, of course, became a popular motif in Christian imagery, and it's just possible that that was inherited from Buddha images. In this one, he's sitting in front of the Bodhi tree. You can just barely see some leaves and branches behind the halo. There's an attendant figure standing by him on either side, some heavenly musicians up here. His hand is raised in the fear not gesture, but this one does not, to me, look like an idealized sage. This looks like rather an earthly sort of a teacher, someone he's clearly smiling, his eyes are wide open, apparently looking straight at us, the viewer. And this style from central India was realized even more fully in this one, an extraordinary depiction. He's smiling, almost grinning. Again, the halo is there, but it's partly been broken off. You have these very muscular attendants on either side, and this seems like a person who could be immersed in secular life, everyday reality. He doesn't seem otherworldly to me. Also, from these central Indian images, you'll note that the robe is very much lighter than on those ones from Pakistan, because this is a hot climate. So, a number of centuries later, this type of imagery of the Buddha started to emerge. I find this one particularly striking. He's, at this point, we have a halo again, He's sitting in meditation. This Buddha seems to be much more spiritualized than the previous one, and there's just an intensity to that gaze that is startling. Another thing that's different here, the hand position. This is called the earth-touching mudra. Some of you remember that when Siddhartha was sitting under the Bodhi tree, the army of Mara challenged him. Mara said, "Who says that you're worthy to attain enlightenment?" All the heavenly gods and earthly gods had fled. Siddhartha was alone. He reached down and said, "I call the earth as my witness." And the earth responds, "I bear you witness." And at which point Mara fled, and he had attained the victory. So I believe this depicts that exact moment. It's this, rather than looking at us, I think he's looking at Mara, fleeing into the distance and realizing that he has attained Buddhahood. So those are some images. I'd like to reflect on how we should understand the Buddha's awakening, the thing that's represented by all these images. When Siddhartha emerged from the gates of his palace, as you know, he saw that aging, sickness, and death negated everything he had cherished. He concluded that his life up to that point was meaningless and that he would never find fulfillment as a secular person. He renounced life in the palace and he took to the road as a spiritual seeker. He became a master of yogic meditation. Through such techniques, it was said that one could transcend the ego and realize what was called the great self. Although he attained the highest meditative states, Siddhartha failed to encounter this great self. He came to doubt that human beings have any such intrinsic or permanent essence. Next, he tried to achieve liberation through ascetic practices, but this method also proved to be ineffective. Siddhartha recalled an incident from his boyhood when, seeing bugs being eaten by birds, he felt spontaneous compassion for suffering creatures. He resolved to recreate this wholesome state of being by a method that he called the Eightfold Path. The path culminated when he attained liberation during a night of meditation under the Bodhi tree, as depicted in that last image, I think. From that point on, he was Shakyamuni Buddha, a human being who had transcended samsara and realized nirvana. "I attained the supreme security from bondage, nibbana. My liberation is unshakable. This is my last birth. Now there is no more renewed existence." Buddhahood meant that Shakyamuni no longer identified with the constituents of the self as we generally understand it. He was freed from the thirst for renewed existence that drives the cycle of death and rebirth, as understood in Indian religion. Shakyamuni transcended the mentality of samsara, and he experienced perfect completion, or parinirvana, at the end of his life. "Through many births I have wandered in samsara, vainly seeking the builder of this dwelling. O house builder, you are seen. You will not build this house again. All your rafters are broken, and your ridgepole shattered. The mind is dissolved, and the end of craving is achieved." In this wonderful metaphor, the house stands for the notion of a permanent, autonomous self built by craving, the house builder. Shakyamuni has put an end to both the house and its builder. As the Buddha's life was drawing to a close, the disciple Ananda was distraught over what would become of the community after the death of the Buddha. Surely a successor would have to be named. However, the Buddha refused to do so. It may be that you will think, the Buddha's instruction has ceased. Now we have no teacher. It should not be seen like this, Ananda. For what I have taught and explained to you as Dharma and discipline will at my passing be your teacher. Rather than to identify with an impermanent human form, the Buddha should be regarded as enlightenment itself. By an inconceivable chain of causes and conditions, his teaching spread outward from India, eventually reaching Japan and then North America, where we are able to receive it. On this occasion, as we honor the historical Buddha, let's recall his instruction to us: remember me as one who has woken up.